Those of you who know me well know that if I do a Section 25, I'm never seen without these two books, being my Mental Health Act 2001, which is looking in a kind of a sorry state, and my Childcare Acts, a noted and consolidated third edition, which is in fact my second copy, because I lost my first one on the Cork to Dublin train, and you can imagine the amount of laughs I got when I kept asking for, has anyone seen my grey book? How many shades of grey would that be now, Catherine? The book costs €267, and strangely enough, never turned up. So there must be somebody else now who has Childcare Acts consolidated and annotated as well as myself. Now, I suppose, I wanted to speak briefly enough about Section 25, because I'm very conscious that's been extensively and very well covered. But I suppose I act, as you probably know, I act for the state. I have acted for the then Southern Health Board since 1996, and I act for the Child and Family Agency and the Health Service Executive almost consistently since then. And I suppose Section 25 is the voluntary admission of children, and just give you perspective from the HC side as what proofs do we have to have before we bring an application. Now, firstly, since it's a delegated power, I do need to have authorisation from management to bring a Section 25. Secondly, I have to draft my application, which would be primarily under Section 25(1), with orders made under Section 25(6), and then obviously the extensions of 25(9) and 25(10). But I have to obviously show to the court that the court has jurisdiction, that the child lives there or is found in its jurisdiction, that there is a place available in an approved centre. I usually try to remember to print off the mental health register, download from the internet, just to show that the place is a centre. And then I have to bring a consultant psychiatrist and their report to court. And the psychiatrist, I suppose, has to come through a number of statutory proofs. Firstly, that they're obviously not related to the child, but secondly, the child is suffering from a mental disorder within the meaning of Section 3 of the Mental Health Act. Now, Section 3 gives us two options: a Section 3(1)A, which is a serious immediate risk. The child is a serious immediate risk to causing serious harm to themselves or others. Or Section 3(1)B(1), because of the severity of the illness, the judgment of the child is so impaired that failure to admit the child to the approved centre would be likely to lead to a serious deterioration in his or her condition, or would prevent the administration of appropriate treatment that can only be given by such an admission. And Roman numerals 2, the reception, detention, treatment of the person concerned to the approved centre will be likely to benefit or alleviate the condition of that person to a material extent. And the consultant psychiatrist has to say, is it 3(1)A or is it 3(1)B, Roman numerals 1 and 2? Because if you can't say that, then you cannot bring a Section 25. That is the absolute and utter kicker in the case. Once an order is made, it is open to the court, to the judge hearing it, to make various, I suppose, ancillary orders. And the Section 25, on its face of it, looks like a very short. It's a 15 section. There's 15 sections in it. However, there's 15 subsections. Sorry. However, if you look at Section 25(14), the provisions, it says that the provisions of Sections 21, 22, 24 to 35, 37 and 47 of the Childcare Act 1991 shall apply to these proceedings with modification. And that's why this book always comes to, because that is the book that tells me what I can do in the Childcare Act. And I suppose I would get directions, even though strictly speaking they're not necessary, but I do like to get directions for things such as seclusion, restraint and involuntary medication. They're all part of treatment, I think well set out, they're parts of treatment. But nevertheless, I think it's no harm for people to know that these are options and for it to be recited in the order. That's my preference. I know some people think differently. I suppose the other thing is to say is that there are a number of units in the country who are now providing treatment to anorexia for children suffering anorexia nervosa within the country. These are approved centres. The two centres are Merlin Park in Galway, which would have been sort of the leader in the area, and more recently, and it's great to see, Lindara in Dublin is also doing it. And in cases involving anorexia, where they're getting the treatment in the approved centre, we use Section 47 directions to get orders for NG feeding to allow, first of all, the insertion of the tube, any restraint necessary to insert the tube, and also for the delivery of feeds through the tube as well. And I think it's a very positive development, because certainly I'll be dealing with it separate in my latter part of my talk. It has certainly cut down the amount of cases where we've had to go to the High Court, because I think the judges who have heard these cases accept, having heard evidence from consultant psychiatrists, that for a young anorexic, to make sure they have proper nutrition and hydration is absolute essential part of their continuum of treatment, because if they don't have hydrated, their brains aren't hydrated, or they're not sufficiently nourished, their brains become very, I suppose, rigid, I'm sure Jerry now is a better word for it, but very rigid, and therefore not able to take on the other sort of therapies that they need to engage in, such as family therapy, psychological therapy, and other deep-rooted interventions. So I am very pleased. I think that is up and running for about 2 years. We had about a very involved hearing about 2 years ago in front of Judge Devons, who is now retired in District Number 3. And certainly we put our positions to the court, and Judge Devons held that it was part of the continuum of treatment. And as I said, that we have brought those applications in front of a number of judges. I don't believe in front of Judge Daly yet, but that may come soon. And I do think it is part of treatment. It's very good to see that. The other point I have to say is that it is arising out of the judgment of Judge Birmingham in the case of XY. It is essential that a child has representation when they are involuntarily detained. And that involuntary detention, that representation could be either by a solicitor, which will be Section 25 of the Child Care Act, private modifications, or a guardian ad litem, that will be Section 26 of the Child Care Act. And some judges prefer to appoint solicitors because they feel, look, the child has been locked up, they're entitled to say, I want to be free. Some judges prefer to appoint guardians. Sometimes it's very clear, depending on the age and the maturity of the child, which would be more appropriate. In one quite unique case, we had both a guardian and a solicitor, and that occurred in a case where you had a child who needed, there was wider issues that the guardian was very helpful in investigating, wider psychosocial issues, and the child, however, didn't engage with the guardian. The child wanted to get out, so she had her solicitor say, let me out, whereas the guardian was able to do a proper guardian's role then. Just to say that it's the Health Service Executive would bring these applications, and I suppose that is a difference to childcare, where we would have instructions from the Child and Family Agency. I have to say, from my experience, there is a huge crossover between childcare and mental health, and and often children will manifest with mental health issues when in fact there could be significant psychosocial stressors in the background. I am aware that most psychiatric teams, inpatient teams now, would have quite active social work assistance, which is great, because there's often other issues that are the stressors in a child's life that has led them to being admitted to hospital. I should say, however, that the vast majority of children are admitted to hospital on the consent of their parents, and I suppose that is good on one level, because after all, people should be able to live their lives without being interfered with by the state, and it's parents are entitled to allow their deal with their children and parent their children up until the age of 18, certainly. But I suppose there are negatives to that as well, and you have situations whereby children are being involuntarily admitted. They are, not being involuntarily, they've been signed in by the parents, but they don't want to be there. And that is a huge problem, and it is an issue that is currently being considered in the Supreme Court in England, where there is challenges to the admission of children into special care units, which would be equivalent, say, to Ballydowd or Craddock-Newham. There is parents in England can sign their children into what they call enhanced care, which will be locked units, and children, this child has challenged that on the basis that it's not appropriate for his parents to be allowed to deprive him of his liberty to that extent, and where are his rights and all this. that judgment is awaited, but I think that judgment will be very significant when it comes out, because it will have an impact certainly on what I'm going to talk about later, being wardship and overseas, but it'll certainly, I think, may have a knock-up effect here as well, because if we have situations whereby children, particularly children aged 16 plus, who are in units signed in by their parents who don't want to be there, you know, there maybe have to be some other mechanism to deal with those cases, and maybe it will be through more use of Section 25. So just to say that, because obviously a child who is in there voluntarily doesn't have the benefit of either a solicitor or a guardian. You know, and I suppose contrasted to the adult situation, whereby every adult who is in there on an involuntary basis has the benefit of an independent advocate. I suppose one other issue that I'm glad to be able to talk to you about today, and that is that I think there is a huge benefit in having second opinions if people are admitted. And often I find myself like the lone pine in the wilderness saying, do you not want to get a second opinion? Sometimes the child's illness is so severe, it's clear cut the child is unwell, and people say, like, what's the point? I think there's no harm in having a second opinion. I think it's very, from a you know, I'm not sure people have alternative views, but I don't think there's any harm. Certainly if a child is in at that stage 3 or 4 months, you know, and you know, very unwell or maybe not making much progress, it's no harm to have a second opinion at that stage. And certainly I would welcome people calling for second opinions, because often it's very hard to call for a second opinion against your own clients. But I mean, you know, I have done, and I make no apology for it, because I think it is absolutely essential that the rights of children with mental illness in particular are fully vindicated at every level. There are a couple of myths out there. For example, I always get asked by the psychiatrist every time I speak about this, and that is, does it knock down your record that you were involuntarily admitted? And I have to say to them, no, it doesn't. In fact, the exact opposite. Because Section 24 to 35 of the Child Care Act apply to this Act with modification. That, of course, covers the in-camera rule and the ban on publication. So, in fact, no, in fact, I actually believe that they're actually more protected, because it can never be on someone's record post-18 that they were involuntarily admitted to a mental hospital, that they're in-camera rights. So, I mean, the fact they were admitted has to be there, because obviously it forms part of a health history. But the fact that they were an involuntary admission, I don't believe anyone is right, just like someone has no right to know that someone was in the care system. You know, it's the same, you know, unless people, you know, it's the same right of privacy. Now, the only other thing is that there are a number of, you'll see them in sections 12 and 13, there are a number of matters that cannot be, the psychiatrist can't perform, for example, ECT or psychosurgery. If you needed to get the application for those, you need to apply to the district court for permission. But it certainly indicates that certainly the intention of the legislature was that Section 25 is a broad piece of legislation. There is one other thing I do want to say that we do use in relation to children in the care system, and that is the use of Section 47. And that's Section 47 of the Child Care Act. As you know, under Section 25(15), it says references to Sections 37, 18(3) and 19(4) of the Child Care Act to psychiatric examination, treatment or assessment do not include references to treatment under this Act. And for a long time, we thought that meant that children who were in care could not be voluntarily admitted, because their social workers couldn't sign the general consent to treatment for them, like they could. For example, if I broke my leg, I'm in care, my social worker can sign the consent and give an informed consent for my surgery or for my admission to hospital. Whereas if I was going to be admitted to Aisling in Cork, they couldn't. So for a long time, we thought that that's what it meant. And one day, we came in discussion, it was actually Judge O'Leary in Cork District Court number 19. Judge O'Leary said, how about Section 47? I can give you a specific consent. And in fact, we've developed that jurisprudence from that. So when we want to voluntarily admit a child who's in care to a unit, we make an application to the district court under Section 47, seeking a direction that the social workers can sign the consent for the admission, and specified social worker can sign the consent. And what we do then is we review it we follow the same time frame as the Act. For example, we review it in 3 weeks, review them maybe in 3 months or whatever. But it does mean that children can be voluntarily admitted to units, and that is critically important because sometimes a child who's in care might be very unwell, but they don't have a specific mental illness that you can put your finger on. They don't have a Section 3 disorder. They're not, say, haven't got anorexia, they haven't got psychosis, a schizoaffective disorder, or any of the things you can say, oh yeah, that's definitely a Section 3. So it meant that children were not being able to go in and get the assessment done that a child in the community could get done, an inpatient assessment, say a 4 or 6 week assessment. So this means now that they can get that done and they can be treated the same as every other child. So I'm glad to say that we have kind of learnt from our mistakes over the years, because certainly for a long time we believe that children in care could not get voluntary admissions to hospital. I suppose the other area I'd like to talk to you about would be the issue of the High Court and wardships. And as you're probably all aware, that there has been, I suppose, a significant number of advances in the wardship jurisdiction in the past 2 years, and certainly wardship, which of course is governed under the Lunacy Regulation Ireland Act 1871, wardship is used in much more, I suppose, proactively now than it would have been done heretofore. In relation to wardship for a child does not involve an inquiry into whether they're of sound mind or other. It involves the issue of a minor summons, returnable for a certain date, and usually then the General Solicitor or whoever is appointed as committee, and the orders can then be made in wardship. So it doesn't involve any inquiry into the soundness or unsoundness of the person's mind, unlike an adult. Why is wardship used in cases? The reason I think wardship is used, I suppose, in cases where we have statutory mechanisms such as the Child Care Act, where we have the Mental Health Act, and where, of course, we have the new Special Care Acts as well. And the reason why wardship is used is, I think, primarily is for the cases where we're placing children overseas. And my understanding is the vast majority of wards, I won't be corrected on that because I see people from the Mark Moe from the General Solicitors, Patricia and Mary Claire here, the vast majority of the wards, the child wards, are children who have been placed overseas. Traditionally, we would have made children wards court for inpatient treatment for anorexia, the NG feeding. But as I said, since they've developed, the Merlin Park and Lindara have developed their practices, I think we're going to see less and less of those cases, and I think we're going to see more of those under the Mental Health Act. But we are seeing children going to England on a fairly regular basis. So I suppose what happens is that the child is admitted into wardship, and then separate to that, then orders are made placing the child overseas. There are, I suppose, 2 types of procedures invoked, depending whether the child is in care or whether the child is not in care. If a child is in care, then you have to invoke the procedures in the Brussels 2 bis Article 56, and a consent has to be obtained from the English Department of Health, which can take months. I know, Natalie, you had one that took ages. It can take 6 or 8 weeks to come through. If a child is going under the Health Service Executive, we had an argument with the English Court of Protection, or the English High Court, in a case called In Re Z, which involved a child from Dublin who was going to a specialist eating disorder unit in England. And our argument was, this child is not in care. She should not be treated as a person going into institutional care. This child is ill, she's sick, and she needs treatment we can't deliver in this country. And Mr. Justice Baker in the English Court of Protection accepted that argument, and therefore the children who go for healthcare reasons are going under Article 21, which means they do not have to get the pre-consents. There is, I suppose, a bit of concern about that based on this In Re D case that's pending in the in the Supreme Court in England, that if that comes in, then there'll be no more parental consent transfers, because of course the minor cases are all going afoot of parental consent. There'll be no more parental consent cases. Rather, so we may the HC may end up having to use Article 56, but I'd hope that it won't come to that, because, and that's why we're very, very careful in more recent hearings, and I can see everyone who was involved in that more recent hearing here. In more recent hearing, we spent a lot of time going through the evidence and ensuring that the transcript would read for the English Court Protection that, or the English Court Protection, that this child was going for treatment purposes, for treatment that was not available in this jurisdiction, as opposed to going over on foot of parental consent. And in fact, the parental consent, which in fairness, the parents didn't consent from the outset. They got a lot of evidence. They took a long time to consider their decision to send their son away. But nevertheless, we didn't rely on that. We rather relied on the medical need for him to go for treatment. So that is the children placed in England. If they're detained, then the President tends to review them very regularly, and certainly at least every 6 months, and sometimes more often than that, depending how they're getting on. Like we have one case at the moment which is reviewed very regularly. We have other cases that are reviewed perhaps less regularly, but again, they're all case and situation specific. I think that obviously I appreciate it's a very, very old piece of legislation, but it is the only legislation that is available to us, and it's the legislation within which we have to work. In relation to the children, again, the President can make lots of orders on foot of the wardship. So if he would make order taking child into wardship, he would then appoint the committee. The committee would usually go out and get the child's views, particularly if the child is going away to England or being sent over for treatment. Then the case comes back to the court. There's then a hearing about the necessity to have the child sent for treatment, and then the court will make orders for the child's reception, detention for treatment, and give various reliefs and powers to the doctors treating the child, make provision for the child to have outings, make provision for the costs of the parental visits to be covered, the reasonable costs anyhow, to be covered, and the court has a very, very far-ranging jurisdiction to make the orders as it sees fit. I suppose just in relation to adult wardship, I think perhaps, I know there's some people here who have been guardians to adult wards, maybe no harm to speak about adult wards. The situation with regard to adult wards is slightly different, insofar as the adult wards do require to have an inquiry as to whether they're of an unsound mind and incapable of managing their person and property, which is the statutory criteria to be met for wardship. And in those cases, normally you would have 2 affidavits of incapacity, both be sworn within 30 days of the assessment being carried out, and that's then accompanied by a petition sworn by somebody who knows the person, or he has some knowledge of the person. Once the petition and the 2 affidavits are sworn, they're then lodged in the ward's court office. If they pass muster, they're checked over. If they pass muster, then an inquiry order is issued, which has to be served on the person who's intended to be brought into wardship. And the President's own medical inspector goes out and does an independent assessment of the person to see whether or not they meet the criteria for wardship. Once the application has been served, or once the inquiry order has been served and filed, and once the medical inspector's fee has been paid by the HSE, and we don't get to see the reports in advance either, I should tell you, once we pay for that, and once that goes into the court, the case can then be listed for declaration for wardship. And once the person is in wardship, again, the court would have a very wide-ranging jurisdiction to make orders on application in relation to the ward. I suppose effectively the entire ward's care is vested in the court, and I suppose it is a very all-encompassing power. But as I said, we haven't anything. There's nothing else replacing it at the moment. So and we are dealing with people of extraordinary vulnerability. In relation to people who wards of court who are not detained, their cases are rarely reviewed unless there's some specific problem that the court needs to be kept appraised of. Obviously, being made a ward of court is a very significant event. If you're a ward of court, you can't marry at all. You can't leave the country or open a bank account without the permission of the President. So it is and I know there are many organisations who have taken particular issue, a number of organisations take particular issue with that, and are longingly calling for the introduction of the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act 2015. But I'm confidently predicting I'll be retired by the time that comes in, so I hope I won't be eating my words. So I suppose really just to say to you that I both the wardship jurisdiction for children and Section 25, I think, are both being operated as well as possibly they can be in, I think, with trying to keep the rights of people and children to the forefront at all times. And I think that in particular, I'm very glad to see the developments that have taken place in places like Lindara. I suppose we're very much welcome to the input of the District Court in interpreting Section 47 widely, because I think that's the way it was intended to be interpreted. And I suppose in summary, I also believe that the President is doing his level best to try and manage the wardship list in as constitutionally compliant and European human rights procedure compliant as well. There is also judgment, I should say, pending in the Supreme Court in relation to wardship, the jurisdiction of wardship, and obviously that when that comes out, that will have, I suppose, obviously will have implications as well, and that's something that needs to be borne in mind. In relation to the role of a guardian, I think guardian is a really critical and really important role. I suppose one thing I would urge guardians to remember, though, is that being a guardian for a child in an approved centre is very different to being a guardian for a child who's in the care system and who's in the care system, and therefore that's why I'm very anxious that people, guardians in particular, feel free to get second opinions, second psychiatric opinions, because sometimes it's very difficult to second guess what psychiatrists are doing, and there may be a very good rational reason why a certain course of action of treatment has been adopted that you might say, which might not sit easy if you're coming from a, say, social work perspective. And that's why, as I said, if people take anything away from here, is that there's no harm in seeking second opinions. And